Thank you and good morning. Sorry. All right, thank you. Good morning to all. Well, Mrs. James gave a very comprehensive picture of where we are with regard to water supply in Dominica. And actually, she said a few things that I wanted to say. But as Mr. Blackmore said, I will try to focus on some of the engineering aspects and what we plan to do going forward. So just to give a quick synopsis of really what took place. Mrs. James touched on some of that already, but as you know, we were impacted by Hurricane Maria, which affected all sectors, and it's particularly the water sector, leaving a lot of our supply infrastructure in critical states of disrepair. We had intakes being washed away, pipelines being washed away, intakes being silted. We had a lot of damage to all our access roads to some of our facilities, which hindered our ability to repair some of these systems because first we had to create access. So the situation was quite dire. Of course, Dominica, at DOWASCO, we operated 42 water systems, seeing that 2 of them, that's Spirit 7 and Dubic, were decommissioned after Erica. So previously it was 44. And as Mr. Blackmore said, we had critical damage to most of them. Just about 3 or so were able to be up and running from the day after the storm. Now, in terms of the impact of the storm, it affected our ability to supply water, and as Mrs. James said, we were able to engage in a lot of temporary recovery activities in order to try to restore water service as soon as possible. In the meantime, there were a lot of relief activities ongoing because our focus was first to focus on immediate relief to our customers, temporary recovery activities, and then focus on rehabilitation of the systems with the aim of building back better to provide more climate resilience into our designs. So in the event that we are faced by a similar situation in the future, our systems will be more robust and be able to withstand those impacts, and will be able to have a consistent supply of water even after the storms. So with regard to building back better, one of our first things we are focusing on is something that actually was ongoing from after Tropical Storm Erica, supported by the CDB, is to do a strategic climate vulnerability assessments of all our water systems. And with this assessment, basically we would look at all our water systems, look at all the ways that they are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because as we know, the experts tell us that we expect to get situations similar to Erica and Maria more frequently in terms of heavier rainfall, more frequent rainfall, heavier flooding. So we have to find ways to adapt to those, mitigate the impacts of this. So this is the aim of the strategic climate vulnerability assessment. It will focus on all the water areas, and from there it will provide guidance into the Build Back Better process, where we will focus on designs for specific water areas, specific water systems. That process, we had already prepared the terms of reference for that consultancy, and I was recently informed that they're trying to facilitate and expedite the process because a similar activity was ongoing in some other islands, and they plan to use the same consultant, which will shorten the procurement because we were thinking of sending out expressions of interest to get that consultant. So they will just retain the same consultant, modify the terms of reference a bit so that they can fast track the process of doing the climate vulnerability assessment for Dominica. Some of the things that we expect that will be looked at in terms of building back better is, first of all, to choose water sources that are less vulnerable to the potential impacts from the climate change activities. A lot of our water supply abstraction infrastructure are located within rivers. We're looking at our transmission lines that are, for the most part, adjacent to riverbanks and really subject to flooding. So in cases where that's inevitable, of course, you look at improving the robustness, as I mentioned, looking at different ways of installation, different piping materials. We're looking at possibly relocating some of these to areas that are less vulnerable, looking at backup systems, for instance, having more than one intake, also having sources that are characteristically different from each other. So they may not necessarily be impacted in the same way by a particular event. So in the event one goes down, another one that was not impacted, we can then switch over to that one. Looking at increasing our storage in our systems. So in the event that we do have a shutdown for a period, at least we'll be able to have sufficient water in storage that can be used to provide in the meantime until the source can be put back up. Again, improving our water treatment. One of the things that have been affected the most is our water quality in terms of turbidity levels and even our ability of our existing treatment systems to handle the level of raw water that is coming into our systems. So improving the level of water treatment, whereas with additional, let's say, sedimentation, filtration, advanced filtration. So these are some of the things that will be looked at. And again, I mentioned that some of our sources are in vulnerable areas. A lot of this has to do with our dependence on gravity-fed systems, where we need to have these intakes high up in the watersheds to be able to rely on the gravity and reduce our operational costs. So in cases where we may have to relocate these to more secure areas further downstream or away from the rivers that we cannot then rely on gravity, we may have to use more pumping. And in order to really reduce our operating costs, we have to look at more renewable energy options, for instance, solar pumps and so on, and more energy efficient methods, and also having backup power. As Mrs. James mentioned, one of our key challenges right now is the fact that our power to all our systems are affected because of the damage to the national grid. And we have 20 pump stations which were down because we do not have the power to pump. So in those areas, it would have been good if we had more backup power. Mrs. James mentioned that we did have one mobile generator, but we never expected that all our systems to be so impacted simultaneously, and we are in the process of procuring generators. So in the addition to power from the grid, we will look into, for instance, having alternative solar power for the systems and still having standby generators, because also, even though it's a small contribution, but we also have to think about our contribution to the carbon footprint, and mitigating climate change impact has to deal with using less fossil fuels. So we do not want to rely full-time on generators. It will be more as an emergency backup mechanism. And one other possible alternative source in terms of water, I think I mentioned at the previous briefing was groundwater. That should be looked upon as an option where we explore. First of all, we need to explore our potential, know exactly what's the status of our aquifers and the yield and basically the recharge rates, and all these necessary hydrological investigations need to be carried out, so at least we can have options. So in the event that we use a surface source and that is somehow compromised, we can just immediately tap into all our groundwater resources as a reserve or as a backup until we can return to using our surface systems. I mentioned about looking at different methods. Obviously, the design of our intakes is something that has to be looked at because our intakes, they get silted very quickly when we have any heavy flooding, and there are alternative designs that may help mitigate against the impact of that flooding on the intakes and the ability to abstract water. So these are the kind of ideas and things that will be looked at. And as I mentioned, the first step is to look at a broader picture in terms of overall vulnerability assessment. And of course, then that will pursuant to that, there will be studies for specific water systems. We'll also, during these design periods for those design phases, look a lot more at the hydrology and the hydrogeology of these systems, and really not just look at just the basic civil engineering aspects, but really do a comprehensive analysis of all options. Because the idea is that, as I mentioned, to build back better and to have systems that will be resilient and be able to withstand even events more powerful than what we've experienced. That is the intention, that when we make investments, we don't have to go back every 2 years and spending the same money over and over again, because someone has to pay for that at the end. So basically, that's just a overview of, Mrs. James gave the overview of where we are, and this is just basically where we want to be in terms of building back our systems better. So if there's anything else, then we will take that during the questions. Thank you.